I play by intent is something you might have heard once or twice before greeting your opponent for a game of Warhammer 40k, and it represents one of miniature gaming's most time-honored traditions. So today we're going to be talking about playing by intent, what it is, how to use it as a tool to improve the fun of your games, and some ways it can potentially be abused. What's up, folks? Welcome back to TacticalTortoise. My name is Trevi, and today we're talking about playing by intent. Before we get into it, I should mention that the topic of this video is going to diverge a little bit from my normal content, because we're going to be talking about social phenomenon and interactions. There aren't any hard and fast rules based around playing by intent, and some communities may treat it differently than others, and than how I present it here. This is an issue of sportsmanship rather than of mechanics, and while I hope you agree with the points that I make, I'm going to try to cover this topic in a way that I feel is most broadly applicable. In the card game of Magic the Gathering, certain card or mechanical interactions can produce theoretically infinite loops of actions. In order to allow these interactions to exist without immediately blue screening the match in question and forcing players to execute the same plays thousands of times in order to resolve correctly, Magic has introduced a rule that is commonly known as displaying the loop.
So, I'm going to demonstrate the loop first. I then do that again, infinitely. So I'm going to say that I have 16 trillion red mana.
This is a shortcut in these situations and is codified within the rules, allowing a player to perform an infinite theoretical number of game actions without actually having to physically perform any of them. Fortunately for us, Warhammer 40k doesn't have any infinite combos, but it does have something similar, and that is infinite potential maneuverability. Warhammer 40,000, like many other miniature games, is a true measurement game, meaning that its game pieces aren't restricted to movement in certain areas of the board, like along squares or hexes. Instead, the actual physical measurement between game pieces is used to determine their movement and position. This allows for a theoretically infinite variability on how a unit can be positioned, giving the player complete control over exactly how their troops will deploy, but with a cost. With such a level of control, there is an equally infinite potential for boring minutia, and a potential necessity for an unfun level of exactness in order to play the game appropriately. And that's why the community typically adopts this mantra of playing by intent. But what is that? Playing by intent, or making a play by intent, I'm gonna coin that as the active verb here, is essentially the miniature version of displaying the loop. It's a tool for the community to circumvent wasting unnecessary time on largely meaningless exact positioning. Essentially, when demonstrating an intended move, a player will describe to their opponent their intended course of game action, and then execute that action to a reasonable degree of precision. This is usually used to save time on particularly annoying or fiddly movements or measurements. Let's say, for example, that a player wants to position a unit a sliver outside 9 inches of an enemy so as not to trigger an ability or a reactive move, but they want to be within 6 inches of another friendly unit to benefit from that unit's aura. The player might measure or mark the relevant measurements on the table, declare that intention to their opponent, and move their unit roughly into that position. This saves both players time carefully measuring whether or not the models in question are in exactly the correct position to do what they want to millimeter accuracy, and prevents a feels bad interaction where a model might have moved 8.9 inches away from the unit rather than the intended 9.1, and could potentially have triggered that reactive effect. Because the players agreed on the position that those models should be at, they're treated as being 9 inches away. In a similar example, a player could measure that they could get line of sight to an enemy unit while remaining outside of the threat range or line of sight of another enemy unit. So they place their unit at roughly the correct angle to ensure that that's possible, and and then verify their intent with their opponent. This allows models to take an optimal position without being surprised by an angle that they thought they had measured correctly, but were in fact within a fraction of an inch of being misplaced. Someone once described the game state of a game of 40K as a hallucination shared by two people. I can't find that original post, but in searching for it, I did find that Warhammer has a surprising number of hallucinogenic weapons in its universe. Regardless, that's a pretty apt description of playing by intent. Both players agree on the hypothetical position of their models and execute the game based on that agreement without worrying about the specifics or the actual physical placement of the game pieces. This saves so much time over the course of a game and protects the game state from being disrupted or shifted based on outside influence, like models being bumped or knocked over and changing their position. If you declare that you want your models to be on an objective and they get knocked off, there's really no argument that later on in the game they should be on that objective. And at the risk of editorializing, in my opinion, this is the correct way to play Warhammer and games like it. Unlike many other skirmish level miniature games that are much smaller in scale, Warhammer is far too complex and expansive to treat positioning to an exact level of scrutiny. Without this social contracts between two players who want to see the game played out to a satisfying level, executing precise maneuvers would add hours to the game and ruin the fun of everyone involved. But with that being said, the system of imaginary actions has the potential for abuse. For it all to actually work, we need some ground rules. Now this delves a little into the realm of personal opinion, but I've devised 3 basic rules that should be met for a play by intent to be valid in order to prevent abuse of this contract. First of all, a play by intent must be possible. Secondly, it must be demonstrable. And thirdly, it needs to be communicated between the players. The first criteria here is possibility, which I think is pretty straightforward. Playing by intent cannot be used to make your models do something that they cannot do according to the rules of the game. It might be your intention to move your models within range of a 5-inch charge, but if you're 14 inches away from your target, and your model only moves 7 inches, that's never going to happen. There's no legal amount of movement without other effects coming into play that will get you to that distance. It's my intention to roll all 6s and all my dice, so let's just say that that happens. Second is demonstrability. Assuming that an action is possible, it's still required that you are either able to correctly articulate your intention and also demonstrate that possible movement to the other player. For example, if you want your unit to move where no enemies can see you, if you can't dictate where the incoming lines of sight are going to be traced and where the enemy units that could see you can move, there's no way to determine conclusively that your intention is executable. Or if you're trying to make a specific movement within specific ranges but can't demonstrate an example of a legal position for the units in question to occupy on the battlefield, your intended move might need to be rethought. Now, I think the last criteria is the most important. An intended play must be communicated and agreed on with your opponent at the time that it's executed. If you are able to demonstrate and describe your intention accurately, a good opponent should have no problem agreeing to its execution without any additional hassle or wasted time. However, the whole point of the exercise is missed without expressing that intention clearly. If you make a move or a placement without describing your intent to your opponent, in my opinion, they are well within their rights to take advantage of any misposition. Any alterations to your position after the fact would at that point be considered a take-back or a mulligan, which, to be clear, I'm generally fine with, but that needs to be discussed and permitted by the other player. And to be clear, I don't think this communication needs to be a lengthy talk. Just mentioning to your opponent a quick blurb about what you want to accomplish is generally enough. Your units shouldn't be able to see me here, or the idea is that here no one can charge me, is typically all you need to solidify the game state. That communication is so crucial, though, that it brings me to the spiciest section of this video, the common abuses of intentional play. If there is a phrase in Warhammer that raises the hairs in the back of my neck and sets my teeth on edge. That was my intent.
Brother,
Intentional play brings so many incredible benefits to a game of Warhammer. It reinforces the game state, it shortens the game time, and it encourages open communication between the two players, but it is also rife for abuse by unscrupulous players. And to be clear, as with all my content covering chicanerous play in 40k, bad sports are the vast minority of the game. But I do think that the community's tiny population of habitual angle shooters use retroactive playing by intent to cover up their mistakes, or to sometimes gain an unfair advantage against your opponent. And it's against these kinds of players that you have to be vigilant. Now, I had a whole series of well thought out and articulated examples and clips that I'd pulled from live streams to showcase misuses of intentional play. But the goal here is not to throw players under the bus, nor is it to confuse you with overcomplicated examples. So I'm going to pitch it to a much more inebriated and much less eloquent version of Trevi from a recent live stream. Like, let's say, for example, if we go back to TTS, I'm going to keep this dude here. And you're like, my intention is not to get within line of sight of your guy with the laser gun, your Ridge Runner. And you move your model and you move him here, and the guy's like, oh, there's a line. Maybe like this, whatever. There's a line. Oh, I can see past this ruin like that. And you go after the fact, you go, oh, my intention was to stay out of line of sight, so I'm gonna go here instead. Right? For the most part, that seems fine, except if you had not caught that, right, that person would have gained 3 inches of movement around that wall. If you didn't declare your intent and you didn't place that model correctly, and after your opponent goes, I'm going to move and shoot that guy, you go, oh, my intention was to be farther back here. I think in those situations, you just got to eat it, dude. My intent is to win. Now, as you can imagine, this can get pretty complicated, especially in situations where things like deep strike screening or objective control comes into question. And most of the time, these can be rectified with a simple take back. Now, takebacks on positioning are totally fine. I've definitely mispositioned my fair share of units in stupid ways and had to ask my opponent for a takeback to fix one of my dumb mistakes. And I might go so far as to say that players should be generous with takebacks to smooth out the stress of the game and generally make it more upbeat and cordial. But the point is that this can create a pattern of behavior, and there have absolutely been players within the community who abuse this social contract to gain these incremental advantages over their opponent over the course of an entire game or a tournament without being called out. So it's important to be wary of situations like these, where a player is consistently calling out their intention retroactively, and be less lenient of it as the game goes on. And this is why I think the ground rules that I mentioned earlier are so vital for playing by intent to work correctly. I also think that players should just be okay with a good old-fashioned fuck up.
Okay, don't want to pick anything up. I don't know if I want.
Broodlord that far forward. That was stupid. No, I should have kept the Broodlord model back here so I could fight first, but I didn't do that, so oops. It's okay to marginally misposition your models occasionally. Perfect play should be a goal that we strive for, but it should not be something that's taken for granted. And making a mistake or failing to pre-measure a threat range, leaving a spot for a deep strike, or not being in range of your auras is just something that can happen in a game as complicated as 40k. And instead of being declared as your retroactive intention, it can sometimes just be accepted as a lesson we can learn from. But let me know down in the comments what your opinion is on playing by intent. Thanks for watching all the way to the end of the video, and thanks as well to everybody who supports the channel either over on Patreon at patreon.com/TacticalTortoise. YouTube channel members, you can join down in the link below the video to get early access to videos and some exclusive videos as well as everyone who supports me over on Twitch to get early access to my Twitch VODs. All you people are amazing, and I love you. Remember to keep it classy, folks, and have happy wargaming.